Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am so glad to see all of you at this session. My name is Gabriel Davis. I will be moderating. This is our We Represent LGBTQIA panel. We have our first panelist here, Mario, but I'm going to go ahead and give the other two panelists a little bit of time to trickle in. So please feel free to take a seat, continue finishing up whatever networking you were doing. I hope you enjoyed the 15-minute coffee break, and we'll be right with you in just a few minutes. Hi, Kat. How are you?
I am good. Apologies for the delay. As everybody knows, computers like updating at the worst time.
Oh boy. Well, we are live, so we're just waiting on our final panelist, Jeremy, and then we will pick it up. Oh, Sean.
Gorgeous picture in the background.
Gorgeous. Well, I'm so excited to have a really good discussion. I think that LGBTQ representation abroad is definitely not spoken about enough, at least in circles that I've been in. So I think this will be a really nice opportunity to shed some light on that, especially for the people who are watching right now. Gonna give Jeremy just a few more minutes, and hopefully Jeremy will be able to join us soon.
I think that this is a good example of what it's like traveling internationally. No matter how much preparation you do, something always goes wrong and you need to be flexible. So this is a great representation for everybody, you know, what it's like being patient and also just, you know, thinking ahead if things do go wrong.
So to everyone watching, Kat has actually just done my job better than I have, because this is a great segue into taking a cue from Kat and going ahead and getting started. And Jeremy will hopefully be able to join us when he can, if that's all right with everybody. So welcome. I want to make sure to get this panel underway. My name is Gabe. I am the least important person here. I'm going to introduce the most important people here. I'll be taking you through the conversation. And please, if you have any questions, we will get to a Q&A period at the end. Probably around 45 minutes of talk will happen before then. Kat, if it's all right with you, could I ask you to mute yourself? Yeah, just to make sure we don't have as much sound feedback. So let me go ahead and introduce our incredibly distinguished panelists, and I will introduce Jeremy when he gets here. So first we have Kat Claus, who is an educator and advocate who has worked in K-12 and higher education. In 2018, she was BuzzFeed and Bank of America's 50 Under 50 nominee. Her work has been featured in the Huffington Post, New York Magazine, and others, and she currently works on issues like LGBTQ issues, equality in education, student government, sexual assault survivor rights, free speech, and mental health. And then, rounding out the two panelists we have here, Mario Nguyen is, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, is a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, an adjunct professor at Texas A&M University School of Law, and a graduate of Harvard Law School. He is a native of Dallas, Texas, a gay man, and the child of a previously undocumented Mexican immigrant and a Vietnamese war refugee. This is the first in his family to graduate high school. Mario graduated from Western Kentucky University and was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Morocco. Mario has been named one of the best lawyers under 40 by D Magazine and one of HuffPost's 40 Latinxes under 40. So as you can see, we've got a very deep bench here, and I'll be introducing Jeremy when Jeremy arrives, but let's go ahead and kick it off with a softball. are actually not a softball at all. Let's get right into the details, and let's go ahead and start with, how did your exchange program prepare you, if at all, to travel to a potentially homophobic society? And if you would, can you just real quick remind us what exchange program you did and where the country was? Kat, let's start with you.
Yeah, I studied at the Stratford Theatre Festival, which is in Canada, the first time I did. And I reference this one just because I'm from the Midwest in the US and I'm a queer woman. So I thought that Canada would be accepting. And so my exchange program didn't, prepare me for anything. They thought that Canadian society would be the same as the US and that there wouldn't be any issues. And as great as Canada is, everything is different, just a little bit. Anytime you leave someplace which is not where you live, you need to take time to prepare. And so I wish my exchange program did that, and they did not. So my hopeful advice to everybody is, no matter where you're going, even if it's an hour north of where you live or 400 hours north, if you're going completely around the globe and driving, prepare.
Mario, and if you want to go ahead and take that.
Yeah, of course. And just one point of clarification, I was a Fulbright scholar to Mexico, not Morocco. So I just wanted to kind of say that it was similar to Kat in that regard. I think the Fulbright program has changed a lot. They are implementing new D&E, different kinds of programming that you'll hear about later on some of the panels. But at my time, it was, the same thing. There was no discussion about it. We had a giant orientation where they even brought in the regional kind of U.S. ambassador's office security personnel to explain, what the dangers were in specific areas. And there wasn't a peep about being LGBTQ, even though there was still a pretty big, heavy contingent of us. I'd say probably like 6 or 7 of us. And so we kind of informally would chat, but I would encourage anybody watching that if your Fulbright program or CLS or whatever you're doing doesn't have that component, and you think that there may be other people, or you just want to check, email everyone, ask, start the discussion if you feel safe and comfortable doing that. I think the worst case scenario is that there's nobody. Best case scenario, you at least form a little cohort of people, because that's kind of what informally happened, I think.
So 2 things. First of all, mea culpa, Mexico, not Morocco. I've spent a lot of time in Morocco, and I haven't had enough coffee not to make the mistake of reading it everywhere I look. So that's on me. But I think the second thing is, what you're hitting on is a really interesting point about how you were briefed on these societies. And I guess that actually prompts a second question, which is, did you decide to be out abroad? And if you did, what factors shaped your decision?
Actually, thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we get to that, I'm just going to go ahead and welcome Jeremy Sanchez, our final panelist, and give a brief introduction, if that's okay, Jeremy.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So Jeremy Sanchez is a rising 4th-year medical student at the University of Iowa, having spent 1 year doing a Master of Public Health at Harvard. He spent 2 years in South Korea as a Fulbright English teaching assistant. He identifies as a gay, first-generation Mexican-American, and his identities have shaped his perspective both as a Fulbrighter and as a soon-to-be pediatrician for vulnerable communities. So Jeremy, once again, affirming that I am the least impressive person on this wonderful panel. So actually, let me just really quickly repeat the question. We've talked about how our exchange programs prepared us for a potentially homophobic society. But my question for everybody is, did you decide to be out abroad? And if you did, what factors shaped your decision? Jeremy, do you want to kick us off for that, actually? Jeremy, you good?
Yes, sorry about that. Having some technical difficulties, as always. And thanks for the introduction, Gabe. And sorry for being late, everyone. To kick things off, so when I was in South Korea, I decided not to be out publicly. I decided that based on what a few of my friends were saying and based on past Fulbrighters to our program in South Korea that our job was potentially at risk if we had decided to come out as teachers. So I decided to keep quiet for most of the year on terms of that. But I did rely pretty heavily on my cohort to help me process what that meant throughout my years abroad.
Thank you. Kat, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I made the decision to be out openly, and I guess I took for granted that it would be a non-issue. And so I'm very open in my public life, and I've done work in Costa Rica, and coming up, I'm doing education work in New Zealand. So I'm very excited about that. And part of the discussion that I've been having for myself and the things that I think about before coming out is when is the right time and what is the best approach for everybody is a nice little side comment that I will ask, because sometimes I make the decision to come out, but it's not the first thing that I say if it's relevant in a conversation. Because even in societies that are progressive, like when I did my first study abroad at the Stratford Theater Festival, and did work there, I think that there's a lot of assumptions about what it means to be out. And I thought that you had to be out at all times, or if something came up, if somebody was talking about boyfriends and girlfriends, I had to mention my girlfriend. And that's not the case at all. So I just wanted to make that cute caveat that if you're out some places, you know, you don't have to be out everywhere. It's always depending on your comfort level. And sometimes it's not best to come out right here in that moment. It doesn't help yourself. So whatever feels most fulfilling to you, because I wish I had waited a little bit longer until I was more comfortable with the people I was working and studying with abroad to disclose that information.
And then Mario, I want to make sure to get you in on this as well.
Yeah, so I was completely out and open. I was very fortunate. Mexico City has a thriving LGBT scene. I even lived in the neighborhood. They call it the Pink Zone. So it was very gay friendly. There were plenty of gay bars and clubs, and you know, I'd met some organizers in advance that I had connected through social media with. So I even knew some of like the local activists and some of the issues that were affecting the country. But that was all based off my own research that I had done in advance to make sure that it was comfortable and safe for me to do that. Obviously, it's very, you know, Catholic heavy society, so very anti-LGBT. So at times, you know, I was just cautious with what I said and wasn't necessarily just, you know, spilling it out, you know, rainbows everywhere. But if I could, and if it was totally comfortable to do it, I did it at work, I did it at school, I did it anywhere I could. So, yeah.
So I think there's a certain amount of difference per country, and there's also a certain amount of using your judgment based on the situation. But Mario, I actually want to press you on that for a second. And you said you were out a little bit. Did you face any surprises or challenges when you were in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, I faced several from just like, you know, regular harassing. You get people yelling things at you, you know, slurs and all that fun stuff. But that would happen to anybody walking the streets in like the neighborhood in Mexico City. But I think the biggest challenge I felt, honestly, which kind of surprised me, was from like the other LGBT Fulbrighters. They were very cliquey, I think, at times. And there was also like a very stark difference between the way some of the white LGBT people treated the culture or the scene, or were treated in the culture or scene, versus myself. So I remember specifically, I tried going to one of like the like kind of top gay clubs in Mexico City. And while everyone else had been before, when I got there, they wouldn't let me in because I was not Euro looking. You know, I wasn't Eurocentric. I wasn't nothing about me. I'm short, and all that stuff was just a pure reason for them to turn me away. So people don't realize that you know, a homogenous society like Mexico, where by and large everyone is the same race, and you're either that or you're foreign, right? It's very obvious to them. So because of that, they were, you know, different, European looking, and they let them in. But with me, it was just something very different in the community. Everyone would ask me if I was from China. It was never assumed the US. And because of that, I was treated very differently. And I think that none of the other Fulbrighters even tried to kind of stick up for me or do anything that was, you know, kind of what you would expect in the US, where somebody would say, hey, you can't do that to my friend, or or whatever. So at one point I was, this was actually a straight bar, but I was trying to get into a straight bar with my Fulbrighters and they wouldn't let me in, and the Fulbrighters went in without me and left me outside. So that was kind of a really kind of sad experience for me personally, because I felt like I had to kind of go it alone. And so you have to be prepared, unfortunately, for, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, I certainly appreciate your honesty, and I think that we're actually going to talk a little bit later about what resources there are for people on these abroad programs. But I know that, Kat, you also had some difficulties in Canada, and I would love to bring in you on this question.
Yeah, so I surprisingly went down with a cohort. I believe there was 12 individuals who studied at the Stratford Theatre Festival at the same time that I did. And while we were on the way down there, we were paired up with a buddy and we lived in dorm style living. And when I was there on our way down to the trip, we drove for a few days and I had a buddy assigned to me that was going to be my buddy for the whole trip. We got along great. I thought she was fantastic. And at that time I was single and I mentioned that I was queer. I forgot, I made an adage about an ex-girlfriend or something like that. And then suddenly the next day we had buddies reassigned. And I obviously knew it was because she was uncomfortable with how I announced who I was. And so that was really a hard way to set up my first, you know, study abroad experience. I was 21 years old and I didn't know how to better advocate for myself and talk to, you know, the advisors and the ones coordinating this program about why this made me uncomfortable and why this was happening. Because this whole trip, I kind of felt like an outsider like you did. It was public knowledge through some of the people of the group why we were switching roommates and why she was avoiding me during this, you know, whole experience. And nobody stepped up to say that it was okay and nobody did anything. So I was, again, kind of like you, I was left by myself for a lot of things because I chose to come out, and I don't regret coming out at all ever in that circumstance, but I wish I had taken time at 21 to think about how to come out and how to be my most authentic self, especially in places where you're uncomfortable and it's new.
Kat and Mario, can I ask you guys to actually briefly follow up on that? I'd like to set the scene a little bit for the audience. Can you tell us what year this was happening? Just because I think that the dialogue on these issues has changed considerably, and it might be worth mentioning when this took place.
Yeah, I can kick us off. This was 2015 for me. So this was not too long ago. I was freshly turned 21, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I believe I was technically a junior in college, and set off, you know, I think we set off as soon as the semester ended. So this was May of about 2015.
Mine was in 2012. So clearly I was 10 years old when I got the Fulbright, you know, but 2012.
Well, I'm still 5 years old, so I've got a lot of learning to do. But that being said, I want to go ahead and actually direct the conversation similar to what you were talking about, maybe finding resources in country. And I want to start with Jeremy for this question, which is, do you feel like you were able to connect with locals or find queer safe spaces in country?
I felt like I was able to, but it definitely took some time. I decided to live about 3 hours south of Seoul the first year that I was in Korea back in 2014. And it was a very rural village where I deliberately chose it to learn Korean language and culture. But that also conversely made it difficult to find a community. So I was able to make it up to Seoul a decent amount of times. Their transportation system is amazing over there, and was able to make a good group of friends eventually, but it did take some time, and it might in other countries as well, I'm guessing.
And I would also love to hear Mario on this question.
Yeah, so I intentionally sought out that space after living in a variety of different places. I ended up moving to the neighborhood and never felt more comfortable than at that point, and I ended up staying there. It so happened that at one point I had two roommates. One was from France and one was from Canada. but he was actually Mexican born, but he had like lived in Canada for a decade. And we were total random roommates, and we were just having dinner one night, and we all looked at each other, and we were like, I think we're all gay. And sure enough, we were. Just totally didn't know it at all. We were all like timid about coming out. But home was a safe space. My neighborhood was a safe space. And then I ended up seeking out, like I said, activist friends. And so they showed me different areas of the city that kind of had like neighborhoods or specific activist scenes.
That's awesome. And Kat, I actually wanted to return to your experience for a moment because it sounds like you had a lot of difficulties. And I think as we're hearing here, there are some positives, but we also need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that queer people sometimes face abroad. So with that in mind, Kat, did you have any particular coping mechanisms that you used or that you found useful in country?
Yeah, I think we are very fortunate to live in a time where the internet is accessible in most of the world or most parts of the world. And so I used an online community. I looked where I was studying and found that my cohort was not LGBTQ accepting. I think some were. I just think that it was not the LGBTQ space that I was looking for too, even those who were accepting. They were just allies, which is great, but I felt like, you know, at that time in my life, I needed somebody or some people who understand how I felt on a deeper level. So I use online chat boards, the really old kind. Chat boards in 2020 are really pretty. The ones in like 2015 were just like base text. You didn't get an avatar or a profile or anything like that. But I made my own community. I would find people on chat boards and I would say, hey, can I direct message you? And we would talk about our experiences. And I ended up finding people who were studying abroad and doing other fellowships that I would have never have met and were in different countries. And we really got to share our experiences about that. So I recommend that anybody, if you go abroad, find somebody else who's in a similar situation in a new country, whether it's for work or a fellowship or a study abroad exchange program, and talk to them because they'll know a lot of what you're feeling, especially individuals who are LGBTQ identifying, because I feel like it's one of those things where people take for granted love wins. I think I was surprised that I would need a special community because gay marriage at this time had been legal in Canada for a number of years, where it wasn't, you know, federally legal in the US when I started to leave to go there. And I thought that that meant that there would be no homophobia and that I wouldn't need people to talk to who are similar to myself. And that's not the case. No matter what country you're in, I think it's important to have people that you trust and can talk to about issues close to your heart.
So it seems like you and Jeremy are actually in agreement about that. And I know that both of you did have difficulties. So with that in mind, I mean, I guess I would want to shift also to acknowledge the fact that it wasn't just you in country. There was a program, right? And so what best practices from that exchange program do you think would have been helpful to you going abroad as a member of the LGBTQ community? Jeremy, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I actually came out while I was in Korea. I started figuring that out at the end of college, and I had no idea what questions to ask either. So I think one of the things that South Korea's orientation, which lasts 6 weeks long, could have done would be provide us a kind of a hard copy or something of the sort of LGBTQ resources, communities, both as Kat was saying, online or in person, that I could have turned to for support or for like where are the quote unquote gay areas in Seoul that eventually I came to understand and know, but going into it would have been great to know from the beginning.
Kat, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I'd really like to emphasize Jeremy's spot. I think that my program at the time, I don't even think that they knew I was queer identifying, but I think that there's a lot of assumptions that they base. So I hope that program directors stop with those assumptions. Oh, a student would tell me if they're LGBTQ identifying. I'm also a queer disabled woman, so I've got that double identity going. And I think there's also a lot of assumptions about what my experience would be like for me as a disabled person that were not true at all. So because they think Canada is this great safe haven. I want to make a plug. I love Canada. I visit frequently. But because the country is one way in one part doesn't mean it's that way in this other area and location you're going. So program managers should find local specific resources, which are sometimes hard to do, or even just a starting point. So individuals, when they go to a new country, they know at least where to go or that it's safe to come to you with those questions, because I didn't feel comfortable asking those questions to our program administrators when I was 21 years old. And I think my experience suffered for it, that I didn't plan ahead of time. There could have been, for all I know, there could have been a gay bar down the street. But because I was afraid of those questions and that it wasn't brought as an acceptable thing to ask and it wasn't discussed at all, I didn't think it was appropriate in the workplace. I didn't know how to be a queer professional.
Right. And I think that there's definitely certain areas in which a lot of study abroad programs can make improvements. I know in my own, the discussion around that was something like, homophobia is uncomfortable, you might experience it. And there wasn't much of that written infrastructure that you're talking about. But look, I also would be remiss if I didn't ask about the countries themselves, because I think there's a reality in which these countries might have been picked explicitly for how they treat queer identities, but there's also definitely more to that. So I want to unpack that a little bit and actually start with Mario. Mario, do you think you could kick us off and tell us why you chose Mexico?
Of course, yeah. So as I mentioned, my mother was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. She was an economic refugee, and she fled one of the border towns, both because of gang violence and because of economic disparities. And so she came here, worked hard, dropped out in middle school, and my father was a war refugee. So he, came over, same thing, dropped out of high school, and both of them have these kind of native countries that they were connected to. I would see their struggles, and I grew up knowing that I was different. I was treated differently, I looked differently, my name was difficult to pronounce as a kid, and I constantly saw this thing in the mirror that was different. And I wanted to know why, and I wanted to know more about it. You kind of have this existential question about, where is this part of me? And, I don't feel like I'm from there, but supposedly I basically am. And so I think that duality with American identity becomes an issue, and you need to go explore it. So for me, I struggled between choosing Vietnam and choosing Mexico for the Fulbright, but I ended up going with Mexico because my Spanish was better. So for me, it was kind of me search in that respect. But it was also a chance to go do something that I felt like I really wanted to. I wanted to go abroad, but we couldn't afford that. I'd never been outside the country before. And so the Fulbright was actually my first time abroad. I didn't even study abroad before it. I was just thrown, head first in. But I was extremely prepared, because of that. I did a ton of research. I had gotten everything, like my cell phone working in advance. Like I bought a card from like a Mexican cell company, had them ship it to the US so that I could walk in, in hand with the phone. Like I was ready to go. But that's, why I picked the country. It was both personally fulfilling, but the grant I had was also very specific, and I picked it because it was a business grant. So unlike most Fulbrights, I didn't do research. I actually worked at a nonprofit and was enrolled in business school at the same time.
Okay, thank you for saying that. I was actually going to ask if you could clarify which grant you did, so that's perfect. You've anticipated that. Kat, why Canada?
Yeah. I actually regret choosing Canada as my first choice, not that it wasn't wonderful, but because I feel like I limited myself. So I mentioned earlier that I'm disabled, and I mentioned that because I'm hearing disabled and physically disabled. It is a part of the conversation that I had. I am a first-generation college student like Mario. I didn't have any money, and I didn't realize that you could get funding for programs like this, or substantial funding. I thought I'd have to take out extra grants and loans. And so my school had a relationship with Canada. And so I thought that that was my only option as a queer disabled person to go abroad. And so it was also my first time abroad. I got a passport for this trip. It was delayed because of issues not in my control. And so I was up every night. I had my bag packed. I was just waiting for the passport to arrive in the mail. And I'm so glad that I went, but I think that assumptions of what homophobia are specifically and disability rights access stopped me from a lot of opportunities that I now regret. Canada was a great experience. I'm glad I got to learn and study there and work there. But I think that the assumption that if you're different and you're not going to fit in immediately, that it's not a worthwhile study abroad experience or study exchange or international exchange program. And I think that that is completely false. So I hope individuals here, first of all, youth and students looking for opportunities, don't limit themselves, but also faculty. Don't have these biases that prevent students from experiencing life-changing events that is going abroad in any capacity.
Thank you. And then finally, Jeremy, on South Korea. Before we do that, though, I do just want to say, if any of the panelists want to go ahead and jump in and kind of continue this conversation, I think we've actually got the time to do that. So just unmute yourself and you can add a comment. But Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, actually, it was really interesting hearing your perspective, Mario, on your kind of juggling between Vietnam and Mexico. My parents are both from Mexico City, and so I was debating between South Korea and Mexico. Why South Korea? I started making a lot of friends from around the world when I was at Grinnell in Iowa. It's a surprisingly diverse college for being in the Midwest, or rather in Iowa. And I had grown up in Idaho where there wasn't very much diversity growing up. And I started getting very interested in the culture and learned the Korean alphabet. And I thought, our education system is very USA Eurocentric focused, and I have very little exposure to any Asian studies, Asian history, etc. And ultimately asked my mom what she thought about me going to Mexico for a Fulbright to get back to my roots. And when given the choice between the two countries, my mom had told me, oh, you should go ahead and try South Korea. So that's what I did, and the rest is history.
Can I ask you, Jeremy, was there a reason? Because my mom had a particular reason, and for me not going as well. Did your mom have?
So the last time my mom had been in Mexico was 1997, and this is 2014 that we're having this conversation. And my mom had recognized that there had been a lot of changes to Mexico, and she just wasn't sure about the situation anymore. Turns out we would end up all going to Mexico in the next year for a wedding, and I was telling my mom, well, we're going to go to Mexico with or without you. And we kind of, my brothers and I ended up bringing her along that next year, and it was a great time. But yeah, that was the primary reason she chose to tell me about South Korea instead.
My mother actually, when I was going to apply, told me, I fled that country. Why on earth would you go there? And she had one image of Mexico, right? And it's a huge country. Obviously, it's got a lot of different diversity in it, of geography, of types of cities. And she just couldn't, for the life of her, understand it. And, to be frank, she actually stopped talking to me. She told me if I went, she wouldn't talk to me because she was worried that I was going to die, that, I was going to get killed or murdered or kidnapped. And the funny thing is I ended up getting robbed at gunpoint, but regardless, like, she didn't want to know anything about it. So she just didn't talk to me. And it was the most difficult thing because here I was trying to choose between like understanding myself and this culture that she had, to some degree imposed me with, whether I wanted it or not, and kind of her. And so it was a difficult decision, but I think that's something that people don't talk about, is that this kind of, when you're international, like, or at least from your origin or when your parents are, there can be sometimes a pushback on whether or not you should even leave this great land of opportunity. And it's not necessarily leaving, it's just, going and gaining more enriching experiences out there. So if that's something somebody out there is dealing with, I hope it's normal.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I actually want to take a moment, I'm sorry, Kat, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I would say one of the reasons I ended up choosing Canada as my place to study abroad was also because of my mother. My mother was worried as a disabled person and a queer person that I needed to find a country that was accepting. Originally, I was looking at Poland and Germany before I did this. And that's why I said I regret going to Canada, not because it wasn't a great experience. I'm still glad that I went. But for my first experience, limiting myself, because the entire time that I was there, there's my mom's voice in the back of my head, you know, telling me safety tips, even though it was real Canada, and being so glad I was there, because if I had, you know, a medical emergency as a disabled person, you know, she knew healthcare would be taken care of. And so, like I said, I think family voices impact more than I should have, because I was looking for more what would make my family feel comfortable than what would make me feel comfortable in my experience.
Well, I can definitely speak to that. I think that I've had my, oh, hello, another panelist. I think that I can definitely speak to that experience of having sort of my family voice in the back, figuring out what I'd like to, well, what does Gabe want? No, what do they want? And it's always a conversation. I want to ask a related question to that, because it is about the country, but I think it's also about the program you choose. What, you know, for example, Mario, you said you picked a very specific Fulbright grant. And so I want to ask all of you, and you know, you can feel free, Kat, if it's all right with you, we can start with you, but how important was the program you chose, and do you have any regrets? Kat, I feel like this might be a great place to kick off.
Yeah, so my university, Northern Michigan University, is a very small school. So study abroad through the university, you know, was a very limited program that they had. And one of the places we went was Canada. And so I felt very limited by just what my university was doing. And I think that that is a huge mistake as well. I was like, well, they're going to Canada. I'm really interested in Poland or Germany, but my mom says it's scary. So, you know, I guess I can't go there. I guess I'll go to Canada. And like I said, I'm glad that I went, but I also didn't realize how much funding, as I said earlier, there was out there. So the Canadian program, you know, had a stipend, it had room and board covered, and all these other things. And I didn't know to look more or to ask more questions. So I feel like a broken record, keep saying that, but ask questions about the program that you do pick. Even if you are sure it's the one for you, there's extra funding out there and there's extra opportunities. You just have to know the magic password. And the magic password is just whatever the right question is.
Jeremy, do you want to do that?
Yeah, so absolutely no regrets. I know that from the majority of this panel, I've spoken about some of the challenges that came with being queer in South Korea, but coming out of the experience, I still credit it to this day. Career-wise, personally, the experience was one of the most formative in my life, and it will continue to be so, especially because because I came out there. I still keep relationships up, conversations up with some of my former students who are now entering grad school, which is amazing, and I could not have asked for a different experience.
And then Mario, you can finish us off.
Absolutely. So I always tell people there are kind of three buckets in the Fulbright program. I think there's like the research bucket, there's an English teaching bucket, and then there's a third bucket of just like miscellaneous random things. I mean, there are Fulbright grants out there for you to like film a documentary or to like make music. And in my instance, the binational business program was something they have contemplated replicating to other countries because it's just a very difficult structure to copy. It doesn't always get changed over, but basically you get matched with a nonprofit or a business of some sort, and you're also enrolled in a business program, like a business school. And I wanted that experience because at the time I was debating both law school and business school, and it was way better for me to kind of get that experience and see if I wanted to do business school or not. So that's kind of why I picked the program.
Well, briefly, I want to say a couple of things. First, to the audience, we're going to start taking questions in about 7 minutes. So if you want to go ahead and start putting them in the Q&A, you are more than welcome to do that. But second, I really want to foot stomp what Jeremy said about not having any regrets, because I think of course, the point of this conference is to educate all of you about the opportunities that are out there. But I think the other truth that we have to hold is none of these experiences is going to be perfect. Was my Boren experience perfect? Was my critical language scholarship experience perfect? Absolutely not. But would I recommend them? Absolutely. And with that in mind, Jeremy actually set us up pretty well for the next question, which is this idea that study abroad can have a real measurable impact on what you do in the future. So Mario, if it's all right, could I just go ahead and pick on you again and ask, what do you think the impact of studying abroad has been on your current career as a prosecutor?
It's very practical. So when I went off to go do this, like I said, it was more about me figuring out if I wanted to do business school. I decided obviously that wasn't the right path for me, and I went off to law school. So I went off and studied, worked, did a few years at a firm, and now I'm at the Department of Justice. So as a federal prosecutor, one of the units that I oversee and work with, one of them is healthcare fraud, but one of them is foreign corrupt practices and bribery. So obviously having an understanding of business workings in Latin America is substantial, because a lot of our cases arise out of bribery that happens in Latin America. And so having the language, the business knowledge, and like the understanding of how relationships and kind of, I guess, customary things may occur in the course of business is so insightful for those kinds of investigations. So I think when it comes to looking at any of those things, they get thrown to me because I can be an extremely useful tool. And I think that's a result, purely of the Fulbright program.
Cool. And then Kat, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think my experience changed the trajectory of my whole life. So I am mostly an education and advocacy consultant. And so one of the things that I found when I was in Canada is they do education different, of course. But I also realized nobody was talking about best practices, and why don't we look at what other countries are doing and bring it here. And so I now, have been leveraging that experience for tons of things. On Wednesday, I was contacted by a nonprofit in New Zealand who wants to collaborate with me. And so I wouldn't have realized that abroad opportunities were for me, or even something to look out for in my career, had I not had this experience. And so I had always planned on being a teacher, and I now call myself an educator because I'm still, in K-12 and higher education in just a different form. And I think that is, something I think high school guidance counselors should recommend, is get an abroad experience, whether it's an international exchange program, a study abroad, or just a personal trip, because I think that's so important for personal development.
Selfishly, I think if there's one thing I wish I had growing up, it's being natively bilingual. Like, man, do I wish I was natively bilingual, but that's another Pandora's box for a later time. Jeremy, what about South Korea? I know you mentioned, obviously, very personal. You came out at that time and that really shaped your experience, but was there anything in there that spoke to you as far as medical school?
The most direct connection that I would say to my Fulbright experience is being able to connect with people from many different cultures that I do on a daily basis in the hospital. I think, though, that in a different way, South Korea was kind of the last catapult into global health that really got me doing this MPH that I just finished at Harvard, and wanting to practice social medicine as much as I can as a future pediatrician. It just reminds me over and over that medicine is so multifaceted, and thankfully that is changing now. Medicine used to just be to doctors, here's the biochemistry, here's the biology behind what's going on with a patient. But these sociological, anthropological reasons behind health are so prominent in our patients that it's just so important to have these experiences, I think, to any future doctor who will be treating patients from a variety of backgrounds.
Absolutely. And I also don't want to be dismissive of personal experiences, because a lot of these experiences are intensely personal, and I know mine were as well. So with that in mind, I would love to open it up to all three of you as a conversation and ask sort of, you've talked about your professional trajectories. What about your personal trajectories?
I will jump in with this one. So I am also, like I said, a first generation high school graduate, was raised by a single mom in rural Wisconsin. So my world was very small, you know, a small farm town. I just, I saw, you know, different worlds on TV, and I read everything I could about other countries, but I never thought I would go there or I would have these experiences. And so when I went abroad, it kind of felt like I had finally made it, that all these doors would be possible for me. I said, if I can go abroad and get to do work and study at the same time and get it paid for, what else can I do? And what else can I use as a personal leverage to get farther in life? And so I think it was kind of a really pivotal time in my life for confidence. I don't know if anybody here will believe this, but I used to be shy and a little bit quieter and less assertive and less talkative. And that all changed after my experience.
Jeremy or Mario? Jeremy, do you want to head up? Do you want to start that?
Sure. I think I could probably say something similar, honestly, to Kat. I would say I had confidence issues, maybe, so to speak, going through college, self-esteem concerns. And I think once you find yourself in your element, going through such a tough experience, tough and rewarding, it shows yourself like, wow, I can actually do this. And I don't know. I mean, I definitely still have lots of moments where I have self-doubt. Comes naturally in medical school to most anybody. But I think that's probably the biggest thing I took away from it personally.
Yeah, so Gabe, earlier you mentioned this idea of kind of growing up bilingual and having that exposure. And it's funny because you would think that with two, you know, immigrant parents, you would get that at home, but you really don't. Your parents, I think, at least in my experience, can use you as a way to learn English. And so when I was a kid, around like probably 6 or so, my mom wouldn't speak Spanish at home anymore because she was really being intentional about trying to learn English at the time. And so she would, you know, practice and talk to us all the time. And that was great for her. But as a result, we didn't really gain any Spanish out of it. And we had the exposure, obviously, but it wasn't something she taught to us or, you know, sat down and had a concerted effort about. So when my sister and I became older, you know, you kind of, life has a funny way of hitting you, and you want to, you know, pass that down to your kids, and you want to understand your culture and who you are. And so we had this language that we were close to and had exposure to, but weren't really good at. So I had to kind of take courses and teach myself the grammatical part of it and the structure and get myself there. And then I needed the kind of close the loop immersion experience. And so going abroad gave me that kind of final pin. And I feel like completely solidified my Spanish abilities, but it wasn't until that moment. And it's so funny because people always, you know, they say, well, of course it was easy for you. You know, you grew up with that at home. And it's like, no, that's not how that happened. Like, it was not something I was taught. It was, you know, I got the exposure, but like I put a ton of work into this. And that's why I have the ability that I have now.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things it makes me think, and I'll say this as a preview for my next question, which is just what I'm thinking of now, because it looks like we don't have any questions in the Q&A just yet, so we can go a little bit longer. One of the things that makes me think of is the whole question of assimilation, right? Especially when you're abroad. I think that there's a moment where it's hard to say, you know, okay, I'm here to be a part of the culture in good faith, but there's also a moment where it's about learning. And to a certain extent, it's about balancing those self-interested objectives with an interest in seeing you as part of the whole. And so, Mario, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that tension, if you saw it at all in Mexico, or if anyone, or if Jeremy, Kat, you saw it in Canada and South Korea. You know, how do you be a good, how do you be a citizen of this country insofar as you're living there, but also make sure that you are learning for yourself? How do you strike that balance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to jump right in on it because I have really strong feelings about that. And I think that it was really hard to sometimes watch other Fulbrighters who would kind of tokenize the experience or the culture. And they were trying to do something that I think, you know, we were doing on this conversation, for example, talk about the experience and the negative parts of it. But when they would do it, sometimes they would cross the line into kind of condemning the country or the people. And I felt like that was unfair because when, you know, you love a place, you know that you can criticize it, but you can love it at the same time. And there's that duality that you're able to express. But I think that you have to be careful not to just hate on a country, not to hate on people. I mean, because they're good, you know, and bad to everything, obviously. So I think you have to be open to learning, to knowing that you're not gonna, you know, understand everything and that it's okay to be uncomfortable. For example, I noticed that a lot of people who wanted to like become native or whatever would start cursing a lot in Spanish because they felt like that's how Mexicans spoke. And that wasn't true. I mean, they sounded trashy, honestly, because it was just not how people sound. But by doing that, they felt like they were native. And so you have to, I think, really take a step back while you're there, analyze yourself, analyze your behavior, what you're interpreting, and be critical of yourself and be comfortable with being uncomfortable because there are going to be so many moments where, you know, you're exposed to something and you don't know how to react and you're going to do it wrong, and that's okay. But you just have to own that. You have to say, you know, I don't know what to do here. I think this is the right thing and I'm doing that. Is that correct? And if it's not, then ask somebody. You know, they're more than willing to help you. But just really try to be self-aware because that's a hard thing for people abroad. I think you're already uncomfortable and you don't want anything else layered on top of that. But you know, that's the point of the experience.
And Kat and Jeremy, feel free to jump in at any point on this question.
Yeah, I'll go. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways for me is that, of course, as we know, no country or community is autonomous. So they're not all one way. And so I spent time in Toronto and we went through rural Canada, and those were very different places. And I think I was still at a time in my life where I was working on what's called code switching. So the example is you talk differently and use different words with your friends than you do with your boss. And that is such an important personal skill. And especially when you go abroad in situations you're not comfortable with and you're not sure. And I've gone abroad to Costa Rica and a few other countries. I always listen first before I talk, especially in foreign countries. And I think that that helps set the tone of conversation. So what words are other people using? Are they formal? Are they informal? And that was a real change for me as somebody who learned to be talkative, to instead recognize that this experience is a lot of listening and to take in and to let the experience change me. And so code switching is a very valuable skill that I think a lot of people have, they just don't have a word for it. So when you don't have a word for it, it's harder to work and plan purposely to develop that skill. And anybody planning to go abroad should work on those interpersonal skills.
Absolutely. Jeremy, do you want to get in on this or are you good?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, kind of an addendum, I guess, to both Mario and Kat. Well, I think one of the things I noticed about, at least teaching in Korea, is that both the students and my cohort got a lot out of both immersing themselves and learning the culture, but also the language. Because the students can definitely tell, and your co-teachers can tell when you're very disinterested or even mildly disinterested in either the culture or the language, and you're not putting forth the effort to integrate yourself to some extent. And that's doing a disservice to both the country and to yourself, honestly. And thankfully that didn't really apply to very many Fulbrighters that I was on, that I was working with. But it did apply to a significant amount of expats and foreigners that I had met while living there. And I think that was one of the most frustrating aspects of the Fulbright for like in my relationship with foreigners, I think.
Jeremy brings up a really good point that I want to jump off. Thank you for mentioning that as something I've been meaning to mention today. I am a hearing disabled individual, and I went to Canada, and a large parts of Canada, they speak English, but they also speak French. And so I admit at 21 years old, I thought, oh, I'll just get by with English. I didn't feel the need to look up a single word in French. I just figured, you know, I'll Google it if I need it, wasn't super interested. And I feel like even though I might not have the capacity and the amount of time that I did to become fluent in French, I still missed out on a lot of nuances of their culture by not even making an attempt ahead of time to prepare and while there to ask questions. Because once people would come up and talk to me, you know, in French, they would just turn and realize that, you know, and I was an American and I never asked for them to clarify. There's a lot of words and meaning, especially in theater, which is what I did, that I missed out on, and a lot of culture that I think I ignored because I thought I didn't need to know about parts of that. So if you are fortunate enough to go into a country that does have, you know, a lot of English speakers or around a lot of English speakers, that's great. That's a wonderful opportunity to connect on a deeper level, but there's so much more to the culture and language, even if it's, you know, silly sayings or metaphors that they have. Every country is different. And really pay attention to language, because language and culture go hand in hand, and it is so important.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of how I experienced language in my own experiences. I think when I got to a certain level of language, what I had to decide for myself about being in a culture which had norms that were demonstrably different from the ones I'm used to is, you know, just because I have this language doesn't give me free license to use it in the way that I necessarily think I should. If I see something that I don't agree with, that's not necessarily mine to comment on as an outsider. And so I think it really challenges you to figure out, you know, is my language a cudgel that I use to kind of smack around people who understand it? Or is my language a bridge, or is it something else? But that's a note for later. I actually want to pause now. This is an excellent conversation. I want to give the audience a chance to go ahead and voice it. We do have a question for the panelists, we do have a question from the audience, which is, was the queer community you immersed yourself in mostly locals in country or other expats? And anyone can jump in on this.
Well, for me, it was definitely elsewhere. I did, you know, like I said, I made my own community online. So I made a point of finding out other LGBTQ individuals in Canada to talk through some of what I was dealing with. But a lot of them were just other expats, like you said. I made a really good friend who was doing actually a Fulbright, and I think it was Thailand at the time. It's been a few years. And she was talking through that, you know, the different experiences that she had there. And we were both dealing with limited internet, which was just a little joke that you thought there'd be a lot of differences in our experience, but our complaints were very similar.
Mario, I'm going to go ahead and assume that your community was mostly locals.
Yeah, it was. I mean, my roommates, obviously, one of them was from France, and the other one, like I said, was Canadian, but he was Mexican born. And so he was very much, you know, in tune with like a lot of local things, but it was largely local. I don't think I really hung out with Fulbrighters at all, even though there were other ones. But it was mostly just, local people.
Jeremy, do you want to get in on this?
With my experience, it was mostly other Fulbrighters, just simply because of the geographical difficulties in meeting the local gay community. But I think if you're placed in a bigger city, that might be a little easier.
Okay, this actually gets us to a question that I wanted to ask anyway to make sure that people are aware who are watching, which is, are there any international or regional organizations that do LGBTQ work that people should be aware of when they're abroad? Kat, I know you have pretty strong feelings about this, so you are more than welcome to go for it.
Yeah, I found one as an adult that I wish I had known about sooner. So Chamber of Commerces exist in almost every country. They're, are business development organizations, and they're really interconnected. And there are sometimes LGBT Chamber of Commerces. I have worked for one in the past, and there's some in countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I am planning a work trip to Costa Rica this year, and Costa Rica has one. And so these individuals know the gay bars, they know the hangouts, the coffee shops, the nonprofit organizations. Again, this more pertains to countries where, LGBTQ issues are, able to be promoted and where homosexuality isn't illegal. But that is a wonderful place to start for a lot of different countries, because I think that businesses, especially like bars and coffee shops, are where people meet, where community connections happen. And so even if it isn't necessarily an LGBT chamber, they will likely know where the LGBT businesses are.
Mario, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, just tell people to check out Asher and Lyric. Asher and Lyric is like a travel website, and they have a bunch of safety kind of measurements that they use for, like, what it's like being local in a country, and being LGBT and all that. So I'd check them out.
Well, so we are getting on the last couple of minutes in the panel. I do just want to ask a follow-up question to pick up a thread that we actually started on earlier, which was, I think all of you gave amazing answers to this question. I asked about the tension between kind of taking from a country, but also being in that country. I actually want to talk about the tension between being in that country and giving back. And I think that reaches a lot to my programs, because I know in the past I've received government study abroad grants, and I've taken issue with the idea that I'm supposed to be a cultural ambassador for the United States. And I think that I have a lot of strong feelings about that. I'll save them for another panel. But I'm wondering if in your programs you felt the need to kind of perform your identity in order to be representative of American culture while also trying to assimilate to a certain extent.
I will jump in with this one again. I also have strong feelings because I felt like I was the token American, or that's the reason they were doing this. Arts in each country, theater styles are actually very different if you are not aware. And I felt like I had to live against the stereotype of the typical American. And so a good example of that is when we went out to dinner with a whole bunch of people, not just what I was studying with, but theater individuals in that Stratford Theater Festival. I really wanted fries, and I sat there staring at the menu for 20 minutes deciding I can't get French fries because it's too American at this little pub. And it's a funny little joke that I was stressing over what to eat, but it kind of goes to what you were saying, Gabe, about being a representative for your whole country. And how do I want to do that? And what were their impressions of me? Because I wanted to just be like everybody else. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to immerse myself in the culture rather than have the conversation be about, like, what I like in America or how different it is. I didn't want to pay attention to the differences at that moment. I didn't want to reflect. I just wanted to be in the moment.
Thank you. Mario or Jeremy, if you want to jump in, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in real quick and say that for me, the experience was like it was easy to get, like, kind of immersed in, like, it was easy to have an immersion experience with people there and kind of get a lot out of it. But giving back was really difficult because you never, I feel like, want to overstep and, like, tell people what they want or give them something they don't need. You never want to be a savior, right? I mean, that's a horrible complex to have. So I think you really just have to ask, and then you have to find the spaces that you're invited to. And so part of it, like I said, was I really linked up with a lot of activists early on and just found out ways I could support. And part of it was just being present at rallies or things that they were doing. And so I participated in that. And then eventually I found, like, an open space. And that, at the time, I was really big into slam poetry, and they had these competitions there because it was a newer thing in Mexico. And I had never done slam in Spanish before. So I figured, let me give it a shot. And it was an open venue to everyone. I asked if it was, fine for me to do it, and they said, sure. And it was kind of in that way that I was able to contribute a story to, them about, like, the idea of this dual kind of identity between being American and having an origin country there. And I think that was a good cultural exchange that happened, and had a lot of people that talked to me about it afterward, and that they didn't know that kind of duality exists for people that were, you know, originally from there in some respect, but are now living in the US.
And for me, I just want to add one quick thing to the last question before I answer this one. In terms of resources, make sure that you find out, as I feel obligated to say this as a future public health practitioner and medical doctor, your like STI testing centers. Sexual health, very important wherever you're at. But in terms of this question, as kind of a lighter skinned Mexican American, I'm kind of placed in Korea as the concept of race in South Korea is still evolving, and it's mostly either white or black, and I'm placed in the white race category. So me trying to integrate what it means to be Latino in America was a very interesting experience, and it was it's going to be, I knew it was going to be immensely difficult in the space of only 1 hour a day being able to teach kids what it means to be my identity. And I think I just did the best that I could in that respect, teaching things that maybe other teachers might not talk about, like Dia de los Muertos, events that we celebrate in our family, but knowing that I couldn't do justice to my full identity while I was abroad.
Well, thank you all for your responses, and I really appreciate that. I do want to do one last question, and then I think we can wrap. And I think this is a really important question because we have spoken about resources that are abroad, but I also think that there's a really important element in just staying safe and kind of having the basic know-how for how to stay safe with your identities abroad, regardless of whether you're out. Mario, would you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and so there's a very particular reason, obviously. I think I mentioned earlier that I was robbed at gunpoint while I was there. And so that was obviously really like traumatic. But part of it was because even though I thought I was prepared, I was being irresponsible and unsafe in that city. And so one of the things I think you can do is you can contact the local embassy if there is one for the US and find out, you know, measures of how to stay safe in that country. And I think obviously for some LGBT people, you can't hide that, you know, you can't just turn it off or go stealth or whatever. And so you need to be able to know how to, you know, carry yourself in a way that isn't going to put yourself at risk. And it may be through locals or through, you know, the local ambassador's security office that they'll be able to tell you, avoid this neighborhood, avoid this or that, because that may be the case that you do need to avoid certain areas to be safe. So I would just throw that out there for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Kat, Jeremy, are you good, or would you like to jump in?
I have a quick note, not specifically about the experience that I did formal learning abroad, but some of the trips that I've taken. I went to Costa Rica extensively, and I'm hoping to go back this year as well. And one thing that I felt misled about, it was my first time going to Costa Rica a year and a half ago, was that I went to some touristy areas and I asked the locals like I thought I would. I was like, I'm going to do my own research. I'm going to ask where I, as a small disabled woman, queer woman, where it is safe for me to go. And of course, the tourist areas were like, oh, this whole, you know, San Jose is, you know, safe everywhere you go. And as you can imagine, that is not the case. So think of where are reputable areas of information and don't just take one person's word for it. Thankfully, I was very safe, but I did stumble into some unsafe situations because you know, people were trying to sell me a product. These were, you know, touristy areas I was being in, and they had an imaged upkeep. And that kind of ties back into what I thought about Canada. Canada is a great country, but they have this image that, you know, they're welcoming of everybody. And by and large, the country is, but there are rural pockets where, you know, I didn't loudly announce at the bar that I was queer. And I think that that's, you know, something to keep in mind that is very region and local specific.
Gabe, you're on mute.
All right, well, I think that this is probably a good place to wrap things up if everybody's okay with that. And I just want to say that I think for the audience, you have heard a lot of different experiences. You've heard 3 different perspectives from 3 very different countries. I know that I am all the wiser for it, and I'm going to try and take some of this to heart. And I hope that this was as educational for you as it was for me. The only thing I would ask the panelists to do, if they would like, is to share some contact information in the chat if people have other questions that they would like to ask one of you individually. You can share whatever contact information you are comfortable with. But the other thing I would say is if anyone has any final thoughts they'd like to get in just before about anything that we've touched on in this panel now, I think would be a good time. All right.
Happy.
All right, well, Mario, did you want to say something? Okay, perfect. Well, then, thank you all so much for coming. It has been an absolute thrill to see you here, and we look forward to seeing you in other panels throughout this conference. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our incredibly impressive panelists.